The Herero and Namaqua Genocide in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, was one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Between 1904 and 1908, German colonial forces, led by General Lothar von Trotha, aimed to suppress a rebellion by the Herero and Nama peoples. This campaign resulted in the deaths of over 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations. The conflict began in January 1904 when the Herero, under Chief Samuel Maharero, rebelled against German colonial policies, which included land confiscation and forced labor. The Nama, led by Hendrik Witbooi, joined the uprising later that year. In response, von Trotha launched a military campaign with the objective of defeating both groups. Von Trotha issued an extermination order, forcing the Herero into the Kalahari Desert, where many died from starvation, dehydration, and poisoned water sources. Survivors were captured and sent to concentration camps, where they were subjected to forced labor, malnutrition, and poor living conditions. Many also faced medical experiments. The genocide involved the confiscation of Herero and Nama lands, dismantling their economic and social structures. In recent years, Germany has formally acknowledged its role in the genocide, offering apologies and engaging in discussions about reparations. The long-term impact on the Herero and Nama peoples remains significant. The Armenian Genocide, perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire during and after World War I, is widely recognized as the first modern genocide. It occurred between 1915 and 1923 and resulted in the systematic killing of approximately 1.5 million Armenians through massacres, forced deportations, and starvation. This campaign aimed to eliminate the Armenian population from their ancestral lands in eastern Anatolia, driven by nationalist concerns and wartime fears. The genocide began on April 24, 1915, when hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, political leaders, and community figures were arrested in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This event, now commemorated as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, marked the start of a larger plan to decimate the Armenian population. Following these initial arrests, Armenian men across the empire were often separated from their families and executed. Meanwhile, women, children, and the elderly were subjected to forced deportations, resulting in death marches into the Syrian desert, where they faced death from exhaustion, starvation, and dehydration. Armenians were marched for hundreds of miles under extreme conditions, with little access to food or water. Many died en route, while survivors were attacked by Ottoman soldiers and Kurdish militias. Those who survived were often sent to concentration camps, where many perished due to poor conditions, or were executed upon arrival. The deportations and killings led to the near-total destruction of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. The motivations behind the genocide were rooted in Ottoman nationalism and wartime fears. The Young Turk government, which came to power in the Ottoman Empire, aimed to Turkify the nation and viewed Armenians as a potential threat, especially during World War I, when some Armenians were accused of collaborating with the Russian Empire. This concern contributed to the regime's decision to remove the Armenian population, which was justified as a wartime security measure. The genocide also involved the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage, including churches, monasteries, and other landmarks of religious and cultural significance. Widespread sexual violence was reported, with Armenian women and girls being abducted, raped, or sold into slavery. These events were documented by diplomats, missionaries, and survivors, though the Turkish government has long disputed the characterization of the events as genocide. The Ottoman authorities maintained that the deportations were necessary wartime measures, though many historians view the campaign as a systematic effort to eliminate the Armenian population. The Armenian Genocide had a significant impact on international law, contributing to the development of the concept of genocide. The atrocities committed against Armenians inspired Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, to coin the term genocide in 1944, defining it as the intentional destruction of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The events also influenced the creation of legal frameworks after World War II, including the 1948 Genocide Convention, aimed at preventing future atrocities. Despite extensive documentation, Turkey has long denied that the events constitute genocide, instead attributing the deaths to civil strife and wartime conditions. This position has led to tensions in international relations, particularly with countries that have formally recognized the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian diaspora continues to seek full international recognition and justice for the victims. The genocide is commemorated annually on April 24th, known as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, with Armenians worldwide honoring those who perished. For the global Armenian community, the genocide remains a central aspect of their historical memory and identity. The Holocaust, orchestrated by Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime during World War II, was one of the most meticulously planned and executed genocides in modern history. The Nazis aimed to eliminate not only Jews, but also Romani people, disabled individuals, LGBTQ+ persons, Slavs, and political dissidents in their efforts to create a racially pure Aryan society. Over 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, were systematically murdered. The groundwork for this genocide was laid over several years through a series of laws and policies. Most notably, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 formalized racial discrimination by stripping Jews of their German citizenship and banning marriages between Jews and non-Jews. These laws embedded anti-Semitic ideologies within the legal framework of Nazi Germany, leading to further persecution. Jews were increasingly isolated from public life, economically marginalized, and subjected to violent pogroms such as Kristallnacht in 1938, which marked a transition to more aggressive forms of anti-Semitic violence. As World War II escalated, the Nazi regime shifted from persecution to the final solution, a plan aimed at the complete annihilation of the Jewish population. Jews were forcibly relocated to ghettos, where they endured overcrowding, disease, and starvation. From these ghettos, they were deported to concentration camps and extermination centers, including Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where millions were systematically executed. The methods of extermination employed by the Nazis included gas chambers, capable of killing thousands in a single day. Victims were often told they were going to take showers, but were instead herded into sealed rooms and gassed to death. Beyond the camps, Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, followed the German military into Eastern Europe, executing Jews and other targeted groups en masse, often by firing squads. Many victims were also subjected to forced labor in harsh conditions, where they died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or disease. At camps such as Dachau and Buchenwald, prisoners were subjected to medical experiments, with Dr. Josef Mengele conducting human trials, particularly on twins and disabled individuals. The liberation of the camps by Allied forces in 1945 revealed mass graves, emaciated survivors, and the skeletal remains of those who had perished. These discoveries exposed the full extent of the genocide. In the aftermath, the Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, establishing legal precedents for prosecuting genocide and other atrocities in the future. The Holocaust remains a significant historical event, highlighting the consequences of unchecked hatred and totalitarianism. The systematic nature of the genocide, combined with the global response during and after its occurrence, underscores the importance of education and remembrance to prevent future atrocities. The Indonesian Genocide of 1965 to 1966 occurred in the aftermath of a failed coup attempt in September 1965. Indonesia's army, led by General Suharto, launched a campaign against members and sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI. This anti-communist purge, supported by Western powers concerned about communism's spread in Southeast Asia, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people over the course of several months. The violence targeted not only PKI members, but also ethnic Chinese communities, intellectuals, and left-leaning activists. The methods of execution included mass beheadings, torture, and sexual violence. In rural areas, rivers were filled with the bodies of those killed, and entire villages were destroyed to eliminate perceived opposition. Death squads, organized by the military and local militias, carried out these killings. Foreign governments, particularly the United States and Britain, provided covert support to the Indonesian government, supplying intelligence and weapons. Following the purge, Suharto emerged as the country's de facto leader and later became president, ruling Indonesia for over 3 decades. For many years, the events of the 1965 to 1966 genocide were not widely discussed within Indonesia. It was not until the 21st century that survivors and their families began to speak more openly about the atrocities. Although Suharto was removed from power in 1998, the legacy of the genocide continues to influence Indonesia. The Cambodian Genocide occurred under the Khmer Rouge regime, led by Pol Pot, between 1975 and 1979. During this period, an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people, nearly 25% of Cambodia's population, died as a result of mass executions, forced labor, starvation, and disease. Some estimates suggest that up to 3 million people may have perished. Pol Pot aimed to transform Cambodia into a classless, agrarian society. The Khmer Rouge sought to eliminate all perceived enemies of the revolution, including intellectuals, professionals, and ethnic minorities, particularly the Vietnamese and Cham Muslims. Individuals who wore glasses, spoke foreign languages, or displayed traits associated with urban or educated life were often targeted for execution. These policies contributed to the dismantling of Cambodian society. After seizing Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge quickly dismantled the state. Cities were forcibly evacuated, and millions of Cambodians were relocated to the countryside to work on collective farms. The 4-year plan aimed for agricultural self-sufficiency, but mismanagement, forced labor, and harsh conditions resulted in widespread famine and disease. Cambodians were subjected to hard labor, with food and medical care in short supply. Mass executions and torture were widespread. Tuol Sleng Prison, S21, became infamous for its role in torturing and executing over 17,000 prisoners, with only about a dozen survivors. Prisoners, including women and children, were forced to confess before being sent to the killing fields, where they were executed and buried in mass graves. Ethnic minorities were heavily targeted, with an estimated 70% of Cambodia's Cham Muslim population killed, along with widespread killings of the Vietnamese and other groups. The international response to the genocide was slow, and many governments remained unaware or indifferent to the extent of the atrocities until after the regime had fallen. The genocide ended when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December 1978, ousting the Khmer Rouge in January 1979. Pol Pot and the remnants of the Khmer Rouge retreated into remote areas, continuing guerrilla warfare for several years. Cambodia was left with a devastated intellectual and professional class, a ruined economy, and deep social trauma. Efforts to achieve justice have been challenging. The Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCCC, was established in 2003 to prosecute senior Khmer Rouge leaders. While key figures like Kaingwek Iyav, Duke, and Nuon Chea were convicted, many, including Pol Pot, died before facing trial. Despite these convictions, the process of justice has been slow. The legacy of the Cambodian Genocide remains significant in Cambodian society. Survivors continue to share their stories, and educational programs aim to preserve the memory of the atrocities. The social, cultural, and economic impact of the genocide has affected multiple generations. Cambodia's efforts to rebuild and reconcile with its past continue, with remembrance and education playing important roles in the nation's recovery. The Guatemalan Genocide, which occurred between 1981 and 1983, was part of a broader civil war that affected the country from 1960 to 1996. During this period, a systematic campaign of violence primarily targeted the indigenous Mayan population. The genocide unfolded during the height of the Civil War, as government forces sought to suppress leftist insurgents, fearing support for guerrilla movements among the indigenous population. The genocide peaked under the presidency of General Efrain Rios Montt, who seized power in a military coup in March 1982. His regime implemented scorched earth tactics, aiming to eliminate any perceived support for the insurgency. Under the National Plan of Security and Development, entire villages were destroyed, and indigenous Mayan communities were accused of harboring guerrilla sympathies. Rios Montt's strategy involved mass killings, forced disappearances, and widespread sexual violence, resulting in significant destruction of indigenous communities. The military's tactics included aerial bombardments and the burning of villages, which left large areas depopulated. It is estimated that approximately 200,000 people were killed during the Civil War, with roughly 83% of the victims being indigenous Mayans. Over 600 villages were systematically destroyed through mass executions and the razing of communities. Survivors were often relocated to model villages, which were heavily monitored and controlled. These environments isolated indigenous populations and reinforced military control over rural areas. The international response was slow, but eventually grew after survivor testimonies and reports from human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and the United Nations brought attention to the atrocities committed by the Guatemalan military. Although Rios Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity in 2013, his conviction was overturned on a technicality just 10 days later, leaving many victims without closure. The legacy of the Guatemalan Genocide continues to impact the country's indigenous communities. Survivors still seek recognition, reparations, and accountability for the atrocities committed during this period. Many indigenous people continue to face challenges related to displacement, cultural destruction, and discrimination. The Bosnian Genocide occurred during the Bosnian War from 1992 to 1995, following the disintegration of Yugoslavia. The conflict was marked by ethnic nationalism, territorial ambitions, and hostilities, particularly between Bosnian Serb forces and Bosniaks. The conflict led to mass atrocities and ethnic cleansing campaigns, primarily targeting Bosniaks, with the aim of establishing Serb-dominated territories. One of the most significant events of the genocide was the Srebrenica massacre in July 1995, where over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed after Bosnian Serb forces captured the town, which had been declared a UN-safe area. Despite the presence of Dutch UN peacekeepers, Bosnian Serb forces, under the command of Ratko Mladic, separated the men from women, children, and the elderly, who were then expelled. This massacre is widely regarded as a key event of the ethnic cleansing campaign during the war. In addition to the Srebrenica massacre, Bosnian Serb forces established concentration camps where Bosniaks faced starvation, torture, and systematic sexual violence. Thousands of women and girls were subjected to sexual violence as part of the war. These actions occurred despite the presence of international observers, and the inability of UN peacekeepers to prevent them led to international criticism. The international response to the genocide was delayed. Despite early warnings, significant military action only occurred later in the conflict. It wasn't until NATO's military intervention in 1995 that the situation shifted, leading to the Dayton Accords, signed in December 1995, which ended the war. The agreement left Bosnia and Herzegovina as a federal state divided along ethnic lines. In the aftermath, the International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, was established in 1993 to prosecute those responsible for war crimes, including genocide. Key figures such as Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic were eventually captured and convicted. However, the process of justice has been slow, with some perpetrators escaping prosecution. The legacy of the Bosnian Genocide continues to influence societal dynamics in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ethnic tensions and grievances persist, and the country continues to face challenges related to reconciliation and rebuilding after the conflict. The Rwandan Genocide unfolded over approximately 100 days from April 6th to July 15th, 1994, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 800,000 to nearly 1 million people, primarily targeting the Tutsi minority and moderate Hutus. It is recognized as one of the fastest genocides in modern history, with a high death toll relative to its short duration. The genocide's roots lay in decades of ethnic tension between Hutus and Tutsis, which were exacerbated during Belgian colonial rule. The Belgian administration established a rigid social hierarchy favoring the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, deepening divisions that persisted after Rwanda's independence in 1962. Subsequent Hutu-led governments continued to marginalize the Tutsi population. The genocide was triggered by the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, on April 6, 1994, when his plane was shot down. The responsible party remains a matter of contention, but this event catalyzed a planned campaign of violence by Hutu extremists. Within hours of the assassination, militias such as the Interahamwe, supported by the government, set up roadblocks and began attacks, killing Tutsis and political opponents with machetes, clubs, and other crude weapons. The role of media in the genocide was significant. Radio stations, such as Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines, broadcasted hate propaganda that dehumanized Tutsis, referring to them as cockroaches and inciting violence. Sexual violence was also widespread, with tens of thousands of Tutsi women and girls raped. Despite multiple warnings about the escalating violence, the international community largely failed to intervene effectively. UN peacekeepers, led by General Romeo Dallaire, were limited by insufficient resources and a weak mandate, which hindered their ability to prevent the massacre. The genocide ended when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, led by Paul Kagame, took control of Kigali in July 1994. But the aftermath left Rwanda in crisis, with millions displaced and a humanitarian crisis unfolding as people fled to neighboring countries. In the years following the genocide, Rwanda sought justice through various mechanisms. The Gacaca courts were established as a traditional, community-based justice system to promote both reconciliation and accountability. These courts focused on truth-telling and restorative justice rather than solely punitive measures. The Rwandan Genocide continues to influence Rwandan society, with efforts toward unity and reconciliation ongoing. The genocide also highlights the challenges faced by the international community in responding to such crises, and its legacy remains significant in global discussions about intervention and prevention. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, comment, and subscribe. for more deep dives into some of the most important events in history. Let us know in the comments which historical event you'd like us to cover next.